to the AgroTalk Podcast from the Sustainable Agriculture Network. We invite you to like, share, and comment on this episode, and to follow the Sustainable Agriculture Network on social media to know more about this global impact network. SAN is transforming agriculture towards a sustainable and equitable future for communities and nature. Today we are joined by Marlène Elias, Gender Lead at the Alliance of Bioversity International and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, and Miranda Morgan, Gender Scientist and Researcher, also at the Alliance of Bioversity CIAT. In partnership, SAN and the Alliance of Bioversity CIAT have developed an important report to advance gender monitoring in agriculture and food systems. Thank you for joining the podcast, Marlène and Miranda.
Thanks for having us.
Marlène and Miranda, could you briefly introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about your work at Alliance Bioversity?
Sure. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. As you mentioned, I'm the gender lead at the Alliance of Bioversity International in CIAT. And my work largely focuses on social forestry, agroforestry, and natural resource management and agri-food systems, all from a gender perspective. So essentially, I conduct research that zooms in on issues related to agri-food systems, value chains, governance of natural resources, restoration, looking at issues related to equity and social inclusion within those, the management of those resources and agri-food systems.
And I'm Miranda Morgan, and I'm a gender researcher at the Alliance of Bioversity International CIAT. I work with Marlène, and my interest in this space was primarily around women's land rights, gender equality and women's land rights, and I've worked in different agricultural sectors. I started with World Fish, so looking at fisheries and aquaculture, and now look at a lot of different types of agroecological systems, thinking about biodiversity and all of this. And yeah, lots of exciting directions where gender equality applies across.
What sparked that interest in the intersection of gender and sustainable agriculture? It's not an intersection that many people are aware of, but that does drive progress in the space of sustainable agriculture. Why is that important, and what's that interest?
So for me personally, it was actually a lesson in what happens when you don't think about gender in agriculture. So when I started my PhD, I was really interested in looking at sustainable food systems, and my PhD research led me to looking at sustainable food systems and how that worked with monocropping in palm oil plantations in Indonesia. And I spent 2 months of my field work going around to interview different folks that were involved in organizing around resisting palm oil plantations, understanding the people who wanted to introduce palm oil plantations and why. And at the end of 2 months, I went home with my notes and I reviewed everything, and I realized that I'd only spoken to men. The only people I'd spoken to men, but women were obviously in the environment. They were working, they were serving tea, they were part of the conversations as well, but I didn't interview them. And it was sort of this slap in the face that I thought, why is it that even though, I think about power in agriculture, it didn't even occur to me when I was there that I wasn't talking to women. So I went back to the sort of the place that I was doing all my interviews, and I then interviewed all the women that I'd missed the first time around to understand their perspectives. And that's really where, for me, it was this light bulb moment that wow, if I completely missed it, what else is happening? How else are women being invisibilized, even though they are there, they're physically present there, but we don't value their voice and their agency in the process.
So it's a big aha moment in your research.
Very, exactly. But I kind of had to make the mistake to get it myself, to really get it.
Yeah. And how about you, Marlène?
Well, I started off driven by an interest in the environment and conservation. And so my undergraduate degree was actually in biology and environmental sciences, and then I specialized in forestry. And by the end of my degree, I realized that conservation was really about people. I mean, they were the choices people made, the ways people interact with their environment that drive or don't conservation. And so I started being much more interested in the social sciences, and I gravitated towards geography. And actually, Miranda and I are both geographers, human geography looks at relations between humans and the environment. So it was a very comfortable home for me. And I pursued my studies looking at agroforestry systems and social relations within those, and looking at value chains that originated in agroforestry systems, so looking at tree product value chains. And it happened very organically, the emphasis on gender, because as Miranda realized also sort of organically that, everything that's happening in the ways people are living their lives, interacting with their crops, interacting with their natural resources is shaped by gender. And if you don't look at that, you really can't understand the system very well. So it started off sort of with that realization and then moved a lot more towards issues of justice and inequality and how those inequalities hinder human relations, the benefits and the opportunities that women generally, the inequalities are in favor of the men in most of the systems where we work, if not all where we work, the systems where we work. And yeah, basically hindering, half of the population and households, and also environmental management and food security and so on. So it was a very organic movement towards the social sciences.
And Marlène, I think this ties well into my next question for you, which is specifically in agriculture and food systems. Why is this intersection and addressing the gender equality issue within this space so crucial to make progress in sustainable agriculture and food systems?
Well, I think Miranda's example is really, really good, that there are a lot of things, a lot of biases that we have as well when we look and try to understand social and socio-ecological systems. And one of those is, we all have our gender biases as well. But once you start to see gender in the landscape, you can't unsee it. It's everywhere. It's prominent, it's meaningful, and it's significant. So once you start to see that, you start to see that there are differences, but also really significant inequalities related to gender when it comes to the opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, that women and men have in agri-food systems, the opportunities to have voice and control over important decisions in those systems, in their lives as well, in their households and communities and so on, that there are really important inequalities when it comes to access and control over resources. So it can be over land being a really significant one, obviously, in agri-food systems that are land-based, but also over other resources, trees, inputs, machinery, credit, and so on. You start to see that the costs, also the distribution of costs and of benefits related to agriculture and environmental management, are not equally distributed. And by costs, one important cost is the provision of labor, for example. So the women are responsible for a huge amount of the labor performed within the home and in the field and in the forest and in in the livelihood systems. But that labor is often under-recognized and undervalued. And that has implications then for who controls benefits and who has voice within the communities and households. And then you start to also see that even policies and programs related to agriculture embed a lot of the biases that I mentioned and reproduce a lot of the inequalities that we're seeing in the field. So, for example, agricultural extension will typically work with male farmers, with the understanding or the perception that they are the farmers and that women may not even farm. And that may be true in some contexts, that women are not in the farm or on the farm, but it's not necessarily true in all, or even in most contexts, women provide a huge amount of the labor that sustains these agricultural systems. So that's the short answer.
So we could say that there is a link between implementing gender responsive practices and having positive sustainability outcomes.
Yes. So just to give an example, there's research that's been done on what difference does it make to have women involved in making decisions around forest management. For example, if you have more women on executive committees of forest user groups, and this is research done in India and in Nepal, that the outcomes when it comes to the rules that are being made, to the enforceability of those rules, and to the state of the forest itself are significant. So it's just an example that links the governance and the voice within those governance systems to, ecological outcomes. But there are also important social outcomes. Of course, we spoke about, equality as a right in itself, women having rights to have decision making and power over their own decisions that affect their own lives. But there are also links. There have been studies projecting that if women had an equal access to resources as men, up to productive resources, productivity would increase from 12 to 18% globally. And there are several studies that have tried to examine the link between women's empowerment and food and nutrition security, for example, showing that as women are more empowered, there are also positive impacts when it comes to food and nutrition security. So those are just some examples. The relationships between equality, women's empowerment, and agricultural and natural resource management outcomes are many.
Great, awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Miranda, let's jump into the brief. Could you give us an overview of this brief and the main objectives of the gender monitoring tools?
Sure. So we started working with ICEAL, which is sort of a learning network and a partner, an umbrella organization of organizations working voluntary sustainability systems, which include agri-food actors and stakeholders, but not limited to. And when we started working with them, we really wanted to understand, for these voluntary sustainability systems, but also the agri-food companies that they worked with, the agri-food value and other actors in the agri-food value chains. What are their main sticking points? Why is it so difficult for them? Recognizing gender equality as one of the sustainable development goals, recognizing, that it's a goal in and of itself, but also, as Marlène mentioned, important for maybe achieving other sustainable development goals. So why, if and a lot of stakeholders were saying, we want to do this, but there are some sticking points and some big challenges in knowing how we do it properly. And those things were really preventing people from taking steps forward. So one of the biggest things mentioned across the board was knowing whether any actions that they were taking around supporting and contributing to gender equality or trying to reduce gender inequalities in their supply chain were actually working. So they were saying, we might do X, Y, and Z, or introduce certain programs, or change the way we work, or encourage women to join executive committees, or enhance their decision-making in local value chains. But we don't know whether that's adding up to changes for the women themselves, for the communities, for the environments, for the supply chains. And having heard this, we thought it would be a really good opportunity to work with SAN. And because they had also expressed that when we did the scoping study and talked to them. And we thought it would be an exciting way to sort of partner together and also kind of try to respond to this mutual challenge. What we knew about gender responsive monitoring is that lots of people do it in lots of different ways. And definitely in recent history, there's been this sort of proliferation of tools. And so people were saying it's not for the lack of things that are out there, but we don't know even where to start. Do we pick this one or that one? What's better about this one or that one? What do we need to include? What do we need to be thinking about to make it, if we wanted to go beyond just being gender sensitive or gender responsive to be gender transformative, what would that take? So there were a lot of sort of different dimensions that we were trying to respond to by putting together the brief. And one of the main features that what we heard people were interested in was really trying to identify indicators that would speak to what they were doing. What would be the most useful indicators to show them that what they were doing meant they were moving in the right direction or achieving what they wanted to. And some people want to do it because they want to have a good communication story and it's good for reporting upwards. Some people want to be able to adapt and learn from their programming. So, they genuinely want to be heading in the right direction, but they don't know what those temperature checks are to know that they are indeed doing that, especially in something like gender equality and social inclusion, where sometimes it might look like you're going backwards or away from your goal before you know that you're getting towards it. So some of those are the reasons why we decided to first do the brief, and then that's why the different elements are in the brief. So the brief covers everything from how to get started in developing a gender responsive monitoring framework. So, what it would include, why you would want to do it, who should be involved in developing a gender responsive framework. So if you're really trying to speak to different value chain actors who, perhaps you want to include them when developing a gender responsive framework, and indeed the rights holders, and sometimes people call them the beneficiaries that you're actually trying to target, should also be involved in that process of deciding what to measure and how to do that. And then finally, the brief, like I said, because there's been this proliferation of resources, we sort of wanted to cut through that confusion and identify or highlight sort of 2 or 3 resources for each type of stakeholder group that could be a good starting point for them.
Let's dive into these indicators a bit more. Why the need to have both qualitative and quantitative indicators to capture this complex dynamic in gender? How does the brief address that need?
So the brief really stresses the importance of having both, because they look and they reveal different aspects of gender equality and of lived experience. So the quantitative indicators will show trends. They'll show trends. You could track over time how those trends are changing. Really, really important. So for example, it's important to know the proportion of women who can access credit, or the proportion of women who own land, to give a couple of examples. And those numbers are also influential in terms of, when you're speaking to certain audiences, those numbers are what people will often remember and cite, and what may be very useful for influencing decisions and also programming. But they don't tell the whole story. So it is important to know what's the percent of women who own land or can access credit. But that doesn't really talk about the experiences that those women have, the meanings behind some of those experiences, perceptions. It doesn't really talk about norms. It doesn't really shed a lot of light on the wider context and how that context can be changing. So qualitative indicators, which often are gathered through open-ended questions, allow people to tell you how they perceive certain situations and why those are important for them. And that's an extremely important aspect of understanding what's happening in terms of gender equality and people's lives and livelihood. So both very important and very complementary in what they tell us, but really one without the other is a little bit, is insufficient for understanding the situation when it comes to gender equality.
And the indicators that were captured in this review, very comprehensive, over 13 resources, thousands of indicators. What stood out to you as the most surprising or enlightening insight from this work?
That's a good question. I think, yes, so the SAN team did a brilliant job of compiling indicators from all different places and then curating it. So we did get it down to a list of nearly 400 indicators. And that was looking at everything on like the indicators that they use for the SDGs, to what different organizations might measure, to what even companies look at when they're thinking about gender equality as part of a corporate or an organizational strategy. What impressed me after some time away from the field and coming back to it is that there are now more indicators and more awareness around measuring things like measuring changes in norms, for example. And so we've included those. I wasn't surprised that the types and amount of qualitative indicators that we found were tiny compared to all of the quantitative indicators that were out there. The other thing about the indicators is there was often a lot of crossover, but yet people worded it really differently. So it made us think a lot about, what it means to compare across goals or frameworks, and whether it is useful that they're all kind of slightly different because they're adapted to people's purpose, versus what the advantage is to measuring it in the same way. So that was something that I think we sort of battled about. I mean, would it be good to have a goal that everybody measures the same thing the same way across? For certain things, definitely, but we know that contexts are so specific and the way that they're interpreted and measured and monitored anyhow would be different. So maybe making them, locally meaningful and adapted is a good thing as well. So we don't want to, by saying these are the 400 indicators we got down to, it's not saying these are the only ones that you could use, but I think it's really important to adapt them locally. And the last thing to say, and this is, I think, important for SAN as well, is that we really were thinking about what gender equality looks like in environmental change related to agri-food systems. And we found it so difficult to surface any sort of environmental indicators. Like I think Marlène maybe remembers, but we had like 8. And we kept thinking, is this about gender and environment? And it was really difficult to find those. And I think we can talk about this more, but the indicators become so individually focused. So they're focused on what individual women do or what individual women have. But we know that, women, first of all, that gender isn't just limited to women, but the impact on, men, women, boys, and girls as well. And also that it's very difficult for us to sort of monitor changes at a level beyond the individual. So we've kind of talked about households a lot, especially in gender, but, how are communities changing? How are collective groups changing because of, maybe more general changes in gender equality? Is that because of collective action, or does that influence or have positive impacts on collective action? And knowing the direction of that is hard. So, Marlène, I don't know if you have anything to add for that about the indicator list.
Well, maybe just to say, I don't know that it was surprising. It was surfacing the, how complex it is actually to monitor gender issues related to gender equality in relation to anything, but in relation to food systems also is, they're huge, both extremely complex nuts to crack, if you will. I can absolutely understand the challenge that organizations have in trying to deal with this extremely complex issue. And, at best we get to approximations. I mean, this is not going to give a definitive yes or no on anything. It's just to try to feel the beast a little bit better, But so I think just the sense of, the complexity, how easy it is to be overwhelmed. And, we talk about qualitative indicators. It's not easy to go out there and to gather and to analyze. The analysis of data is so important. And it's a lot easier sometimes to crunch numbers. I'm not minimizing the challenge of doing that. The challenge of dealing with, textual information, narrative data, and so on is a different challenge. You need different skills. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, all of that, we tried to boil this down in a short brief, strategies and tips and so on, but really realizing that it is extremely complex, and to do it well is a tall challenge. So hopefully it does provide a little bit of guidance, but definitely there's a need to be guided by also the objectives of the organization, and what do they want to learn from their programs, their value chains, their monitoring system, and then to reflect accurately what it is that you've looked at. So if you've only looked at a couple of dimensions of gender equality, then are you, to be a little bit careful and honest about reporting that accurately, and not saying this is how we're faring on gender equality or women's empowerment, if you're only looking at income, for example, or, couple of indicators. So we're trying to open up the issue to show there are many dimensions, and there are many more than what we've captured. We can never reduce such a complex issue to, however many domains and indicators, but we've tried to open that up a little bit so that, organizations are better equipped, companies are better equipped to think in a more comprehensive and holistic manner about what this means. What does gender equality mean? Women's empowerment, and so on.
And a very important part of this brief talks about different levels of approaches that organizations can take towards gender equality. And one of the levels that it discusses is the transformative approach to gender equality. What does this mean in practice, and how can actors go beyond empowerment to achieve this systemic change that is needed in agricultural and food systems?
Okay, I'll try briefly to say, I think a lot of the lessons in working on women's empowerment and gender equality over time is that there have been some more quick wins from, say, addressing things like increasing women's income, even if it's a little bit, and that can provide an important conduit for maybe highlighting to women themselves and to their communities and to their households why, it's important for them to be part of training programs, or why it's important for them to be able to make decisions about their crops. But what we've found over time, and many writers and some of the best writers in the world and academics in the world of gender equality have said for many, many years, is that this sort of narrow focus, especially on women's individual economic empowerment, might actually be more harmful in the long run if it's not also accompanied by more like the deeper level and going beyond these sort of surface changes to really think about the perceptions and the norms and the things that are actually, even if you manage to empower, or if one or two women within a community are empowered, actually it doesn't reach all women, or women of all different types of backgrounds or castes or religions or races. So, the changes that you might observe, and which in the past people have been very happy to say, look, it works, this programming works because this woman here, and there will be a sort of lead female farmer that has benefited a lot from it. But what we've seen over time is that it doesn't reach everybody, it doesn't reach everybody equally, and that sometimes it can prevent people thinking about the really deeper systemic change that needs to happen. And so it's not to rubbish everything that's happened in thinking about women's empowerment, but it's about really getting deeper and to think about how empowerment can be spread, so going wider, and how you can go deeper to influence the systems that actually lead to inequality. So when we talk about that in the scope of the brief, we're really saying, to really, some of the first steps about thinking about what a transformative approach entails is thinking about the types of ways that you measure it. So if you really wanted to think about transforming those deeper systems, you would need to understand them, and you would need to monitor changes in them, and that some of the indicators that we've used to measure it haven't been sufficient, and you need to take that sort of more systemic and holistic approach.
And the steps that organizations might want to take to achieve this transformation might not be simple, but they are truly necessary. What would you recommend for these organizations that haven't gotten into the necessary task of incorporating gender monitoring into their initiatives? Where can they start?
Marlène, you want to have a go?
Yeah, I think they can start with, really having a good critical look at their monitoring systems and working with people who do monitor in gender responsive ways and who do have experience doing that. And that, I think, that would be a great investment, because it would get you there a lot faster and probably anticipate some of the pitfalls. So we, pretty well always recommend, when it comes to looking at gender issues in a significant, meaningful way, intentional way, to work with people who specialize in that area, because they exist. They have a lot of experience to bring to this. So that would be a first recommendation. And then, as Miranda mentioned, there are a lot of resources out there as well. So definitely, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You have to find a kind of formula that is good for you. Know what you want to monitor for, what your purpose is, and maybe don't try to, you don't have to do everything off the cuff, but, having something realistic and developing that and piloting that, and engaging with those who are impacted by the work, so by the women in your agri-food systems, and men and households and so on, women's organizations and so on, who would have also inputs to bring into the system that you're developing, I think would be very useful as a process. And yeah, I would say just, the commitment, the commitment requires resources, so it has to be resourced adequately, just like anything else. And to start, put in those first steps, because every journey begins somewhere.
And Miranda, anything else you'd like to highlight for organizations interested in incorporating gender monitoring?
So I think the brief is a good place to start because we tried to pull together some of those top tips about, what it's about, some of the reflections that organizations might need to have with themselves to start with, who to involve in those conversations and what it's all for. So it's not a long read, but I think it's a good one. The goal is that you don't pick that up and then at the end, you have this perfect gender responsive monitoring system, but that by picking it up, it kind of gives you it identifies some places to start.
And this is a very important tool for organizations to make progress in a much needed area, which is gender equality, and especially in this space of sustainability in agriculture and food systems. Thank you, Marlène. Thank you, Miranda, for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Can I just add one thing? I would just add that I would also move from the idea that this is not an isolated issue in the sense of, I think for organizations that want to do this better, it's really also in the understanding of this will improve your whole monitoring system, your whole understanding of your value chains, your whole understanding of the people you're working with. It's not just a gender issue. It's just for doing what you do better. And that is a drive that should, drive and warrant the investment that you're putting into doing this and the intentionality with which you're approaching this issue. So that's just a closing thought that I think is really important in the way we think about this, to really understand this as a central piece and not a peripheral piece in terms of understanding what you're doing out there and how you're doing it and to what effect.
A very important perspective to incorporate when addressing these issues. Awesome. Thank you, Miranda. Thank you, Marlène.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.